The den did not smell like death. That was the first thing Venetia noticed, and the noticing itself felt like a betrayal of everything she had been told. 17 years of whispered warnings, 17 years of children pulled away from the tree line by their mother's firm hands, of elders who dropped their voices whenever someone spoke of the structure at the edge of Varric's territory. The den, the cursed place, where traitors, murderers are thrown into for the ancient unspoken beast to devour. The mouth of something ancient and hungry that the pack also feed when it grows too restless to ignore. They had told her it smelled like rot. It smelled like cold stone and pine resin and something older beneath both, like soil after rain, i.e. like the inside of a cave that had not seen light in centuries but had not forgotten what light was. She was on her knees. Her wrists were raw from the rope they had used to drag her across the forest floor, and the hem of her dress, the plain, undyed wool she had worn to the bonfire because she had wanted to look presentable, because some pitiful part of her had still believed the evening was for celebration, was torn at the left side where she had fallen, and no one had stopped to let her rise. The door behind her had closed, not slammed, not thundered shut with the dramatic finality of punishment. It had simply closed, as though it required no force, as though the darkness inside was patient enough not to need spectacle. Venetia sat in it and breathed. In, out, in. She pressed her torn palms flat against the stone floor and felt the cold climb her arms, her shoulders, the back of her throat. The darkness here was not the darkness of a room without candles. It was heavier than that, more considered. A darkness that seemed to know it was being inhabited and had opinions about the fact. Somewhere beyond the walls, she could still hear the bonfire. The drums had not stopped. She had assumed they would stop when she was taken. She had assumed some part of the pack would hesitate, would feel the weight of what they were doing, and let the music die in their throats. But the drums continued with the same rhythm they had held all evening, indifferent as a heartbeat, and the sound of them through the stone made her chest do something complicated and wordless that she did not have language for yet. She had smiled at them today. At the bonfire, before her name was called, she had smiled. She had stood among them with her hands folded, wearing her plain wool dress, and when Moret's youngest daughter had stumbled on the grass, Venetia had caught her by the elbow without thinking, a reflex pure and unsophisticated. And the girl had looked up at her and looked away quickly, the way they all looked away. And Venetia had released her and said nothing and kept smiling. She had been smiling right up until Elder Devon's voice had cut through the drumbeat like a blade through linen. Venetia of no line, that was what he called her. Always. Not Venetia of the pack, not Venetia of Varric. Venetia of no line, as though removing her from lineage was a thing that required constant repetition, as though he worried she might forget. She will be our offering, our gift to the Ancient One, our act of loyalty to the peace of this territory. The crowd had roared. She kept returning to that. The sound of the roar, the way it had moved through the assembled pack like a single creature drawing breath. There had been no hesitation in it, no moment where the sound stumbled, where even one voice pulled back. They had roared for her death with the same enthusiasm they roared for festival victories, for hunt returns, for the naming of new pups, and the uniformity of it was somehow the worst part, worse than the ropes, worse than Elder Devon's careful, ceremonial voice, worse than the way the Luna had watched from her seat beside the bonfire with her face arranged in the expression she wore when something unpleasant but necessary was being done. Venetia pressed her forehead to the cold stone floor and allowed herself 3 seconds of something she had never allowed in public. She let herself feel it. All of it. The 17 years of carried wood and dressed wounds and swallowed insults. The mornings she had risen before the pack stirred to have the fires lit so no one would have to wait. The nights she had fallen asleep with her hands still raw from work and told herself it was enough. It was enough. If she gave enough, they would finally... 3 seconds. Then she lifted her head. Crying would not serve her. Fear would not serve her. She had survived this pack through precision, through knowing exactly what she was doing and doing it better than anyone who underestimated her could account for. She would survive this too, or she would die clearly with her eyes open. And she would not give the stone walls the satisfaction of her collapse. She sat up straighter. Listened. The den was silent in a way that felt deliberate, not empty, but waiting. She had expected immediate violence, claws from the darkness, the sound of something large displacing air as it moved toward her. The elders' stories had always been immediate. The beast feeds, the bones remain, clean and conclusive. Nothing moved. The cold deepened around her, and she realized it was not the cold of stone alone. There was something else in it, something atmospheric, the way a room changed when it held a presence too large to announce itself with ordinary sound. The hairs along her arms lifted. Her wolf, normally a quiet and biddable thing inside her, a wolf that had learned early to make itself small in a pack that did not want it, pressed suddenly against the inside of her ribs. Not in fear, in attention. "Something is here," her wolf said, in the wordless language of instinct. "Something is here, and it is looking at us." Venetia stared into the darkness. The darkness looked back. 17 years back. She had not always known her name meant target. She had learned it incrementally, the way children learn most devastating truths, in pieces, spread across years, each piece small enough to seem survivable until the morning you woke and held them all together and understood the shape they made. Her mother's name had been Selah, her father's, Oren. She had been 4 years old when they died, and she had been told it was a fever, swift and indiscriminate, the kind of illness that moved through the lower quarters without apology. She had believed this because she had been 4, and because no one around her had offered another explanation, and because a child with no family learns quickly that questioning the explanations of those who feed her is a luxury she cannot afford. She had been taken in by the pack's lower household, not kindly, not unkindly, simply practically, the way one acquires an additional tool. She cooked, she carried, she cleaned. She was not beaten, which she understood from overheard conversations was a distinction that mattered to the elders. Proof that the pack was not cruel, merely ordered, merely maintaining the structure that kept them strong. She had been 10 years old when Lydia and Lyra found her behind the wood store. She had been crying, quietly, efficiently, the way she had already learned to cry by then, with her back to the wall and her hands over her mouth so it made no sound, because Councilman Breck's son had poured his washing water over the bread she had spent the morning making and had laughed while doing it. And she had 20 people to feed and nothing left to feed them with, and no way to explain the loss without sounding like she was asking for sympathy she would not receive. The twins had appeared around the corner of the wood store like a small, two-headed weather event. Lydia had looked at the bread, looked at Venetia, looked at the bread again. "Who did this?" she had asked. "It doesn't matter," Venetia had said. "It matters to me," Lyra had said, and both of them had sat down beside her in the dirt without any ceremony whatsoever, ruining their good dresses, and Lydia had produced from somewhere about her person a slightly squashed piece of honey cake and divided it with the precision of someone who had been dividing things with a twin her entire life, and they had given Venetia the larger portion. She had not known what to do with that. Kindness without transaction was a foreign language to her by then. She had held the honey cake for a long moment while Lydia and Lyra argued about something unrelated, filling the silence so she did not have to, and finally she had eaten it and felt something in her chest loosen by one small degree. The twins were the Luna's cousins, close enough in blood that the pack afforded them latitude, far enough removed that their association with Venetia was tolerated as an eccentricity rather than punished as a statement. They visited her when they could. They left her things, books once, which she had taught herself to read from, turning the pages by firelight after her work was done. Small defiances, quiet ones. But Venetia had always understood that their protection had limits, and she had never asked them to press those limits. because she would not be the reason something happened to the only people who had ever sat beside her in the dirt. Eric she had understood differently from the beginning. He was not the twins' easy warmth. He was careful, deliberate, a man who moved through the world with the controlled precision of someone who had learned that every action had consequence and was always calculating the consequence before the action. He was broad through the shoulder, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who had very decided opinions about jawlines, and he was the son of Elder Koran, which meant that any kindness he extended to Venetia was not eccentricity. It was risk. She had found the first thing he left her in the doorway of her quarters on a winter morning. A small loaf of dark bread, still warm, wrapped in cloth with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about how to do it properly. No note, no way to attribute it with certainty. She had stood in her doorway holding it for a long time, looking up and down the empty corridor, and then she had gone inside and eaten it slowly by her small, cold window and not let herself wonder too much. He had left other things. A cloak. Dried herbs for the joint pain she had never told anyone she had from sleeping on the narrow pallet in the damp lower quarters. Once, inexplicably, a small glass jar of honey. She had never thanked him aloud. To thank him aloud would be to acknowledge it. And to acknowledge it would put language around something that both of them had agreed, without speaking, was safer without language. But sometimes, at the edge of the training ground or across the fire-lit hall, she would look up and find him already looking at her, not with the expression the rest of the pack wore, the subtle, curling revulsion dressed as disinterest, but with something that had no cruelty in it at all. Just looking. Steadily. The way a man looked at something he was quietly, privately concerned about. She had filed that away in the same place she filed the honey cake and the bread and the cloak, in the small, careful room inside herself where she kept the things that made survival feel like it might one day become something more than mere endurance. She had been standing at the edge of that bonfire, holding all of those small, filed-away things close when Elder Devon had spoken her name, and the crowd had roared and cheered. Present day. The growl did not come from a distance. It came from directly beside her. Venetia did not move. She had no movement left in her. 5 days had taken it. 5 days of cold stone and darkness, and a hunger so deep it had stopped feeling like hunger and started feeling like the absence of everything, like her body slowly withdrawing its investment in her continued existence. She sat with her back against the wall and her knees drawn to her chest, and she waited, because waiting was the only currency she had left to spend. The growl came again, low, resonant, a sound that did not just travel through air but through stone, through bone, through the marrow of things. She felt it in her teeth, in the base of her skull, in that oldest part of the brain that existed before language, before reason, before the careful architecture of a person who had learned to survive by making herself small and useful and unthreatening. That part of her brain said, "Do not move." She did not move. The darkness shifted. She could not have explained how she knew this. There was no light source to alter, no shadow to deepen or thin, nothing visible by any conventional measure. But the darkness shifted the way a room shifted when something large entered it, a displacement of atmosphere. Something was here. Something that had been here all along, she suspected, watching her from the very first moment the door had closed behind her, watching her cry herself empty, watching her curl against the wall and call her parents' names into stone that did not answer, watching her arrive, grain by grain, at the bottom of everything she had, something that had been waiting for her to run out of grief. The heat arrived before she saw it. That was what undid her composure, not the sound, not the presence, not even the fear, but the heat. Sudden and encompassing, the kind of warmth that did not come from outside the body but seemed to wake inside it. She had been so cold for so long. 5 days of cold that had become indistinguishable from herself. Cold that she had stopped registering because registering it required energy she no longer had. The warmth moved through her like a remembered thing, like something she had known before she had words for knowing. And she opened her eyes. It did not touch the ground. That was the first thing. The thing her exhausted mind snagged on and could not release. It moved, and it was vast, and it was silver in a space where silver had no business existing, a luminescence that came from within rather than from any source outside itself, the way certain things carried their own light because the world's light was insufficient for what they were. A wolf in shape, but the word felt immediately inadequate. The way calling the ocean wet was accurate, and yet missed the point entirely. The form was familiar. Everything inside the form was not. Its eyes found hers. Silver. Still. The particular stillness of something that had not been startled in a very long time because nothing it encountered was larger than itself. Venetia sat against the wall and looked at it and felt, distantly and with some surprise, that she was not screaming. She had screamed in the cell when the guards came for her. She had screamed in the square with her voice breaking against stone and sky. She had wept in this den until her throat closed and her eyes swelled and she had nothing left to produce. And now she sat before the most terrifying thing she had ever seen, and she was quiet. Her wolf, that small, biddable thing that had lived inside her in permanent apology, pressed against her ribs, in terror, in recognition. The beast circled her. It moved the way water moved around a stone, not avoiding her, but encompassing her, the circles slow and deliberate, each pass closer than the last, and the heat it carried intensified with each rotation until she felt it not just in her chest, but in her fingertips, in the soles of her feet against the cold floor, in the back of her throat where 5 days of thirst had left something cracked and raw. She sat at the center of it and let it circle, and felt the strangest, most disorienting sensation of her life, that she was being seen, not assessed, not evaluated for usefulness or inconvenience or the particular social mathematics of slave lineage and pack hierarchy. Seen fully. The way she had always suspected she could be seen if anyone bothered to look past the story they had already decided about her before she opened her mouth. The beast stopped. It stood before her, close enough that she could see the silver light of it move, not static, not fixed, but breathing, pulsing with a rhythm that was slower than a heartbeat and older than one. Its eyes on hers, unblinking, and the intelligence in them was not animal, was not human either, was something that had watched both for long enough to be neither. The voice entered her mind the way dawn entered a dark room, not all at once, not announced, simply present where it had not been before. Pure. She felt the word more than heard it. Felt it in her sternum, in the space behind her eyes, in the wolf inside her that went absolutely still at the sound of it, the way small creatures went still when the sky changed before a storm. You are pure. She opened her mouth, closed it. You are the moon. The silence after it was enormous. She sat inside it, and the beast regarded her, and she understood with the bone-deep certainty of someone receiving information that rearranged everything behind it, that it was not speaking in metaphor. She did not know what it meant yet. She only knew that something in her, in the deepest, oldest, most undefended part of her, the part that 5 days of darkness and cold and grief had finally stripped down to, something in that part believed it absolutely. She should have been afraid of what happened next. She was not. The beast moved closer. One slow, considered step, closing the remaining distance between them, and lowered its great head until it was level with her hands. Her hands that were filthy and cracked and still bore the rope marks from the guards who had dragged her across the village square. Her hands that had carried wood and dressed wounds and made bread and folded themselves quietly in her lap at a bonfire, while she hoped, with the stupid, faithful hope of someone who had never fully learned better, but that this time would be different. It looked at her hands. Then it touched them. The contact was a single point, the silver muzzle against her upturned palms, and what moved through her at that touch was not warmth. Warmth was what had come before, The gentle preliminary, the body being prepared for what the mind was not ready for. What moved through her now was everything. It moved through her like a door blown open in a storm. She heard herself scream. The sound came from somewhere distant and did not feel like hers. A raw, torn thing, the sound a person made when pain arrived faster than the body could process it, when the nervous system simply broadcast at maximum volume because it had no other protocol for what was happening. She felt herself fall, felt the stone floor against her back and did not feel it at the same time because she was already somewhere else, already inside something that was not the den, not the cold, not the present moment at all. The first memory was warm. A small room. Firelight. The smell of wood smoke and something cooking. Something simple. Beans and herbs. The smell of a meal made with care from very little. She was small. She understood this from the proportions of everything around her, the way the table was tall, the way her feet did not reach the floor when she sat. Her mother was singing. Selah. The name arrived in her chest before her mind produced it. Selah, her mother, alive and here and moving through their small room with the easy grace of a woman who had made peace with her circumstances without ever making peace with them being permanent. Dark-haired, warm-eyed, the kind of beautiful that had nothing to do with arrangement of features and everything to do with the quality of presence. She was singing something low and private, and not a song Venetia recognized, a melody that felt older than the pack's songs, older than the territory itself. Her father sat by the fire. Oren, broad and steady and quiet in the way that certain men were quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had learned to be careful about when they said it. He was looking at her mother with an expression that Venetia at 5 years old had not had language for, and that Venetia now, receiving the memory through the beast's touch, understood completely. He was looking at her like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. Her small self sat at the table and swung her feet and ate beans and listened to her mother sing, and the firelight moved across all of them, and she was safe. She had been safe. For 5 years she had been completely, unreservedly safe, and she had not known it was rare until it was gone. The warmth of the memory turned. Same room. Later. She felt the later in the quality of the light. The fire burned lower, her small self asleep in the corner on a pallet, a child's unconscious trust that the people in the room would keep the world at bay. Her parents were at the table, and across from them, Elder Devon. She had not known his name then. She knew it now, receiving the memory as her adult self, and the recognition moved through her like swallowing something cold. He was younger in this memory, the gray in his hair not yet complete, but the eyes were the same. That precise, administrative calm. A man to whom other people were variables in an equation, valued or discarded according to their effect on the answer he had already decided he wanted. Her father's hands were flat on the table, a posture she recognized. She had inherited it. The posture of someone receiving news they already knew was coming and had braced for. "The child carries something," Devon said. "Something the pack cannot afford to let manifest." "She is 5 years old," her mother said. "She is a disruption," Davin said, with the patient tone of a man explaining something to someone who was being deliberately obtuse. "Her lineage is already a problem. What she carries compounds it. When it surfaces, you don't know that it will," her father said. "I know what the old texts say," Devon replied, "and I know what I cannot allow." Her mother stood. The movement was sudden, and it made Devon's eyes sharpen slightly. The first crack in the administrative calm, a man recalibrating the variable. Selah placed both hands on the table and leaned across it, and looked at him with an expression that Venetia felt in her own face like a mirror, like something genetic, like a rage so specific and controlled it was almost architectural. "You will not touch her," she said. "While I breathe, you will not come near her." The silence that followed was the silence of a man making a decision. "Of course," Davin said. He left, and the memory fractured forward, days passing in a breath. She did not want to see the next part. The beast held her steady, not restraining, steadying, the way a hand on a shoulder steadied, the way presence steadied, the acknowledgement that what was coming was going to be terrible, and she was not going to be left alone inside it. Night. The same room. Her small self still sleeping. The door opened without sound. 2 men. She did not know their faces, but she knew the emblem on their cloaks. Devon's mark, the council's hand, the institutional authority of men who had been told they were doing something necessary and had chosen to believe it because the alternative was knowing what they actually were. They moved through the room with the efficiency of people who had done this before. Her father woke. She saw the moment he understood, his eyes opening and then changing, the sleep leaving them and something else arriving. Something that was not fear, but was the thing beyond fear. The place a person reached when they understood that what was happening could not be stopped, and the only question left was how they chose to meet it. He looked at her small, sleeping self. His expression did the thing that Venetia, or receiving this through the beast's hold on her, could not survive cleanly. It cracked. Just once, just for a moment, a father looking at his child for the last time with everything he had ever felt about her moving across his face in the space of a single breath. And then he composed it. Deliberately. He composed it into something peaceful so that if she woke, if her small self opened her eyes at the wrong moment, the last thing she would see on his face would not be terror. Would be love. Her mother did not look away from the men. She held her husband's hand, and Venetia, adult and receiving this on the floor of the den, made a sound that was not a scream. Was something beneath screaming. Was the sound of a wound being made in a place that had been carefully protected for 17 years because she had always, somewhere beneath everything, suspected this and had never let herself know it. They had not died of fever. They had been murdered in the night while she slept 3 feet away. And Devon had come to their table and looked her mother in the eyes and said of course and had given the order before he reached the door. The memories did not pause to let her grieve. They moved, present now, recent, the quality of light recognizable, the faces familiar. And she was watching the council chamber, the long table, the faces of the men she had spent 17 years living alongside and serving, and hoping would one day see her. Devon at the head. Elder Corin to his right, on his face carrying the same expression she had seen on her father's face at the table. A man who knew what was wrong and had calculated the cost of saying so and had chosen silence. The other elders. The decision being made around the table with the procedural calm of men administering something routine. The beast grows restless, one of them said. It has been too long, said another. We need a soul, Devan said. One the pack will not mourn. His eyes moved around the table, and his mouth did a thing that was not a smile. I believe we have one available. Her name did not need to be spoken. She watched them nod, watched the decisions settle around the table like dust settling after a disturbance, the natural return to equilibrium of men who had done what was necessary. The memory shifted. Eric's face. Well, she would have known it anywhere, even here, even in the fractured landscape of the beast's truth-giving. She knew the particular way he moved, the controlled deliberateness of him, the quality of attention he carried in his body like a kind of armor. He was in a corridor, speaking quietly, urgently, his voice low and his hazel eyes moving to check that he was not overheard. The twins stood before him. Lydia and Lyra, her best friends, the women who had sat beside her in the dirt when she was 10 years old and given her the larger half of a honey cake and filled the silence so she didn't have to, who had visited her and brought her books and offered her the small, consistent warmth of being chosen by someone when the rest of the world made a habit of choosing against her, who had laughed with her and held her and been the closest thing to family she had built with her own hands in the years since her parents were taken. She watched Eric tell them his plan, watched him describe the cell, the stolen key, the route he intended to take her, the shrine in the neighboring Pax territory where she could rest and begin the longer journey to safety. watched him trust them because she trusted them, watched Lyra nod with the expression of a concerned friend, watched Lydia squeeze Eric's arm with the expression of a woman who understood the gravity of what he was risking, watched them both turn, the moment his back was to them, and walk directly toward the elders' hall with the quick, purposeful steps of people who had somewhere important to be. The memory ended. Venetia came back to her body like a tide returning. She was on the floor, the den floor, cold stone against her back, and above her the darkness of the ceiling she had never been able to see, and she was, for one suspended moment, simply lying there, holding everything the beast had given her, feeling the weight of it distributed across every part of her at once. Her parents, the twins. She closed her eyes and then opened them again because closing them put her back inside it. She lay still and breathed and let the truth settle into their permanent positions. Not processed. She would not process this in a moment, would not process it perhaps for a very long time. But she let it be real. She stopped holding it at the careful distance she had maintained her whole life. The necessary remove of someone who suspected something devastating and had chosen not to look directly at it. She looked at it now. All of it. She let it be real, and she let it be as terrible as it was, and she did not look away. Something moved through her that was not grief. Grief she knew. Grief had been her longest companion, the feeling she was most practiced at swallowing, the one she had the most sophisticated architecture for containing. This was not grief. This rose from below grief. From the place where grief had been compressing for 17 years, and before that 5 years, and before that perhaps before she was born, all the weight of a lineage treated as worthless, of parents murdered for the crime of having a child, the powerful found inconvenient, of a life spent in service to people who had decided before she drew breath that she was expendable. It rose with the particular energy of something that had been held down too long. She felt it in her blood first, a heat that was different from the beast's warmth. This was internal, entirely hers, moving through her veins with a brightness she could feel against the inside of her own skin. Her hands, when she looked at them, were silver. Not silver like paint, not silver like light reflecting off a surface. Silver like the beast, that living luminescence pulsing with the same slow rhythm she had watched move through the silver wolf's form. It ran from her fingertips to her wrists like rivers of light finding their channels, branching and steady, and where it moved, the cold of the stone floor retreated. She sat up. The movement was effortless. 5 days of no food or water, and her body rose with a steadiness that had nothing to do with the body's resources and everything to do with something that was now running alongside them, beneath them, supplementing them from a source that the den could not deplete and the council could not revoke, and the pack's decision about her value could not touch. She stood. The beast was still there. It had moved back slightly during the visions, giving her room, she understood, the way you stepped back from someone receiving a blow so they had space to absorb it. Now it watched her from across the den with those silver eyes, and the quality of its attention had changed. It was not watching her the way it had watched her before, with recognition, with the patient waiting of something that had found what it was looking for. It was watching her the way a guard watched a door it had been assigned to protect. "I know what they did," she said. Her voice in the darkness was different. She noticed this without examining it. The quality of it, something in the resonance. "Yes," the beast said. "My parents. Yes, the twins." A pause, smaller than the others. "Yes," it said again. "I am sorry." She stood with that for a moment. An ancient being, something that had existed since before the pack claimed this territory, saying "I am sorry" in her mind with the quiet sincerity of something that did not perform emotion and therefore only expressed it when it was real. "What am I?" she asked. "You are what they feared enough to kill for," the beast said. "Your blood is old. Older than their pack laws, is older than their council, older than the story they built about who belongs and who does not. You carry authority they spent 17 years trying to bury under silence and servitude and slave lineage, and finally under this. A pause. It did not bury. She looked down at her hands. The silver light moved through them with the patient certainty of something that had always been there, waiting only for the container to stop apologizing for it. "Will you come with me?" she asked. The beast moved. It crossed the den in a silence that was not absence of sound, but something larger. The silence of something that had been still for a very long time, choosing, finally, to move. It stopped beside her. She felt the heat of it against her left side, vast and steady. A warmth that was not just physical, but was the warmth of being flanked by something that had decided she was worth flanking. "I have been waiting for you," it said simply. She turned toward the door. The door was iron-banded oak, ancient and heavy, locked from outside with 3 separate bolts she had heard them throw when they closed it behind her. She had heard each one. That was the kind of thing you heard with perfect clarity when each bolt was also a sentence being passed. She looked at it. The silver light in her hands brightened by 1 precise degree, and the door, all its iron, all its oak, all 3 of its bolts, simply gave way. Not an explosion, not a violent shattering. The way ice gave way in spring, the quiet concession of something that had held against a force long enough and now understood the force was not going away. The door swung open. Light hit her. Morning light. Gray and clean and vast after 5 days of none, and she stood in the doorway of the den and breathed it and felt it move across the silver in her hands and multiply. The forest lay before her, still and cool, and beyond the trees she could hear the sounds of the settlement beginning its morning. Fires being stoked, voices carrying in the early air. She stood in the threshold. Behind her, the beast moved to her side. She did not look afraid. She did not feel afraid. She felt settled, in the way a thing felt settled when it had finally been placed correctly, when years of being in the wrong position resolved into a single moment of rightness so complete it had no edges. She thought of Elder Devon's voice at the bonfire, the ceremony of it, the care with which he had dressed her death in the language of honor and service, a chance to prove her loyalty, a final act. She thought of her mother at the table. "While I breathe, you will not come near her." She thought of her father's face, composing itself in the last moment into love. She stepped out of the den. The forest went silent, not gradually. All at once, the way sound stopped when something moved through a space, and every living thing in it made the same simultaneous decision to pay attention. Birds, wind in the upper branches, the distant sounds of the settlement. All of it stopped, and then from within the tree line, the settlement beyond, she heard it begin. One voice first, then another, then the spreading wave of sound that moved through a crowd when a crowd saw something it could not immediately explain. No footsteps, movement, the particular quality of noise that a pack made when it gathered. She looked toward the settlement and began to walk. The silver light in her hands did not dim. The beast moved beside her, silent and vast, close enough that its warmth was constant, a flank, a presence, an authority that had chosen its position and would not be moved from it. The trees thinned. The settlement opened before her. They were already gathered, as though word had traveled faster than her footsteps, as though the forest's silence had been its own announcement. The pack of Varek assembled in the morning light, and she watched their faces as she emerged from the trees with silver running through her hands and the ancient beast at her side. She watched them see her. She watched the ones who had roared for her death at the bonfire take one step back, then another. She watched the guards, Devon's guards, the men with the council emblem on their cloaks, look at each other with the expression of men whose instructions had not accounted for this particular variable. She watched Elder Devon, standing at the front of the gathered crowd, go very still. He looked at her hands, at the beast, at her face, and for the first time in 17 years of looking at her with that administrative calm, The eyes of a man who had sorted her into a column and closed the ledger. She watched uncertainty move across his face like weather. Good. She stopped walking. The crowd was silent. The morning was silent. Even the fires seemed to burn more quietly, as though the air itself was making room. She looked at Elder Devon, though he had not moved. She understood this about him now, this quality of stillness under pressure, the way he defaulted to composure when composure was the only armor left. He was a man who had survived decades of council politics through the precise management of his own surface, and he was deploying that management now with everything he had, standing at the front of the assembled pack with his hands clasped and his face arranged and his eyes doing their best to hold that administrative calm. His eyes were not succeeding. She could see it from where she stood, the thing moving beneath the surface of him, the recalculation happening in real time, the columns of his internal ledger refusing to balance against what he was looking at. She had been a variable in his equations for 17 years, a manageable one, an expendable one. He had sorted her and filed her, and finally disposed of her with the ceremonial efficiency of a man who was very good at making necessary things look orderly. He had not accounted for this. Good, she thought. And then she began. 17 years ago, she said, 2 people died in this settlement. The crowd was still. The morning was still. Somewhere at the back of the gathered pack, a child made a small sound and was immediately hushed. They were told it was fever. She let that word sit for a moment, let it exist in the air between her and the assembled faces before she continued. Their daughter was 5 years old, and she believed it because she was 5, and because no one around her offered another explanation, and because a child with no family learns very quickly that questioning the people who feed her is a luxury she cannot afford. She paused. Their names were Selah and Oren. They were my parents, and they were murdered in their sleep while I lay 3 feet away by 2 men wearing the council's emblem on their cloaks. She looked at Devon. On your order. The sound that moved through the crowd was not loud. It was the sound of many people drawing breath at the same moment, a collective inhale, the pack breathing together the way it did when something struck all of them simultaneously. Devon's jaw tightened by 1 precise degree. That is a serious accusation, he said. His voice was very controlled. From a woman who has just emerged from the den after 5 days and is clearly... I saw it, Venetia said simply. The words were not loud. They were not aggressive. They carried the particular weight of a person stating something they had seen with their own eyes and would not be argued out of, and the weight of them dropped into the crowd's silence and did not dissipate. I saw the meeting you held at their table. I heard what you told them. I watched your men come through their door in the night. She looked at him steadily. I know what my father's face looked like in that moment. I know what my mother did with her hands. Something moved through Devon's expression. The first crack in the surface, hairline thin. The den showed me everything, she said. Every truth your council has buried in procedural language and necessary decisions, and the convenient silence of people who calculated that objecting would cost them more than compliance. She let her gaze move from Devon to the men who flanked him, the council elders, standing in a loose formation to his left and right, with the instinctive clustering of people who had spent long enough acting in concert that they did it now without thinking. She looked at each of them. She gave each face the full weight of what she now carried. Most of them looked away. You have fed this pack fear for generations, she said. You told them the beast consumed the condemned. You built a story around something ancient and called it a weapon and used it to keep order. Used the threat of it to keep people in line, to ensure compliance, but to maintain a hierarchy that served you. She paused. And when the people you sent were truly guilty, truly corrupted, truly cruel, and yes, they were consumed. Because that is what the beast does. That is what it has always done. She felt it beside her, that vast silver warmth, steady, unhurried, confirming. But the innocent ones, she said, and her voice did something then, a shift in register too small to name but felt by everyone who heard it. The ones with nothing on their hands, the ones you labeled expendable and condemned for the crime of being inconvenient, the beast did not touch them. It waited with them. In the cold and the dark, it waited. She looked at the faces in the crowd. Some of them survived that waiting. Some of them didn't. Not because of the beast, because of what you left them with, because of what you sent them into. The silence was absolute. A woman near the front of the crowd had her hand pressed over her mouth. Beside her, a man stood with his eyes moving between Venetia and Davon with the expression of someone watching two things he had held as separate become part of the same picture. My parents were murdered because I carry something old, something that predates your pack laws and your council and your careful management of who belongs here and who does not. The silver in her hands moved quietly, steadily, visible to every person present. You decided it was a threat. You decided the cleanest solution was to remove the people who would have fought to protect me, and then to spend 17 years removing every reason I might find to fight for myself. She paused. You almost succeeded. Davin took one step forward. She recognized the move, a man reasserting physical presence when rhetorical ground was failing beneath him. He was still tall, still broad through the shoulder, still the most powerful man in the council by any conventional measure, and she watched him remember this about himself and draw on it. The pack will not be swayed by the claims of a sacrifice who has clearly been— "Sit down, Elder Devon." She had not planned to say it. It arrived the way certain true things arrived, not constructed, not calculated, simply present, the right words in the right order at the right moment. She said them at the same volume as everything else, with the same stillness, and they landed with a force entirely disproportionate to their sound. He stopped walking. Not because he chose to. She watched the moment his body and his intention parted ways. Watched him attempt another step and find that something in the architecture of the morning had changed. Some quality of the air or the light or the fundamental agreement between his authority and the world that had always previously honored it. He stopped, and his face did something complicated and private and quickly suppressed. The beast had not moved, had not growled, had not advanced, had not done anything that could be pointed to as threat or coercion. It simply stood. And the ground beneath Venetia's feet seemed to understand something that the ground beneath Devon's feet had apparently just been informed of. She told them everything. She told it in order, cleanly, without embellishment. The way you described something you had witnessed rather than something you were performing. The council's decision to sacrifice her parents. The 17 years of deliberate management. Keeping her useful, keeping her tired, keeping her just fed enough to work, and just hopeful enough not to run. The bonfire, and the decision made around the council table before it, her name chosen not in crisis but in cold calculation, the beast restless and a soul available that no one would meaningfully mourn. She told them about the shrine, about running and resting and waking to find herself surrounded. She looked once at the place where Lydia and Lyra stood at the edge of the crowd. They were together as they always were. The instinctive proximity of twins, shoulder to shoulder. And they were watching her with expressions she recognized because she had spent 17 years learning to read the faces of people who cared about her. And these faces did not look like guilt. They looked like distress. They looked like women watching a situation they had contributed to arriving at its conclusion, and feeling, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what their contribution had been. Venetia held Lydia's gaze. Lydia looked back at her. Something in the older twin's face broke quietly, the way ice broke in the moment before it gave way entirely, a fracture spreading from somewhere central, moving outward. "You trusted us," Lydia said. Her voice was barely audible. She was not speaking to the crowd. She was speaking to Venetia, across the space between them. Or the words of someone who had run out of every defense and arrived at the bare fact of what they had done. "Yes," Venetia said. "I did." She did not say anything else about the twins. She did not need to. The crowd had followed her gaze and made the connection, and the understanding moving through the assembled faces was its own verdict, quiet and thorough. She looked back at the council. "You built this pack's peace on the bodies of people you decided were worth less than the peace," she said. "You used an ancient compact as a disposal mechanism. You called it honor. You called it sacrifice. You called it necessary." She paused. "The beast knows what it is." The council did not go quietly. She had not expected them to. These were men who had spent lifetimes constructing authority and defending it, and they dismantled it in layers. First the denials, then the deflections, then the appeals to pack law and ancient precedent and the stability of the hierarchy. Devon was the last to stop. She gave him that. He held his composure longer than any of the others, standing before the assembled pack with the specific dignity of a man who understood that his story was ending and was attempting to determine the terms. There were no terms available. The pack had heard everything. She had watched the shift move through them across the course of her speaking. Not a sudden reversal, not the dramatic collective turn of a crowd in a story, but the slower, more thorough movement of people revising something fundamental. My people who had lived their whole lives inside a version of events being asked to hold it against a different version, and finding, detail by detail, that the different version fit the facts of their own experience more accurately than the one they had been given. The elder whose son had been sent to the den 12 years ago for stealing grain. He had been guilty, they had been told. The den was the appropriate consequence. His family had accepted this because they were given no other framework for it. She watched his wife's face across the crowd and watched understanding and grief and fury arrive in it simultaneously. There were others. The faces of people for whom her words were not just information about Venetia, but keys to rooms they had been locked out of for years. Well, the truth had a way of doing that, of answering questions people had stopped letting themselves ask, because living inside the unanswered question was the only way they knew how to continue. When the council guards moved, finally, belatedly, with the desperate energy of men acting on an instruction that had already lost its authority, they found that the crowd had shifted. Not violently, simply physically. Bodies that had spent the last hour listening now occupied the space between the council and any useful exit, the unconscious solidarity of a pack that had revised its understanding of who the threat in its midst had always been. Elder Karan did not resist. He walked to where Venetia stood without being directed to, moving through the crowd with his head lowered and his hands loose at his sides. And he stopped a few feet from her and looked at her with the expression of a man delivering a debt he had owed for a long time. "I knew," he said, quietly, just to her. "Not everything, but enough." He paused. "I chose wrong. I chose wrong for a long time, and I told myself it was complexity, and it was not complexity." His jaw worked. It was cowardice. She looked at him, the father of the man who had stolen keys and smuggled food and sat in chains in the village square because he had refused to choose wrong. "Yes," she said, "it was." She did not offer him absolution. She did not have absolution to offer. That was not hers to give, and she would not perform a mercy that did not belong to the moment. But she held his gaze and let him be seen in his admission, and that was all she had, and she gave it. They walked to the den in a procession that no one had organized and everyone understood. Devon first, then the others, 4 council elders, the 2 guards who had carried out the night work of 17 years ago, 2 more men whose faces she had seen in the vision around the council table, nodding at decisions that had cost innocents everything. They walked with the particular quality of men whose stories about themselves had run out, and the crowd that followed was quiet in the way crowds were quiet when they were witnessing something that had the weight of long overdue. The den door stood open. She had left it open. The morning light reached only a few feet into the darkness before the darkness resumed, indifferent and ancient. Devon stopped at the threshold. He turned. One last time he turned, and he looked at her. She looked for remorse and did not find it. She looked for fear and found plenty. She looked for the administrative calculation, the final assessment. Is there anything left to negotiate? And she watched him find his answer in the silver light moving through her hands, and the vast silver presence at her side, and the faces of the pack behind her. There was nothing left to negotiate. "This is what you built," Venetia said. "You told this pack the den was for the guilty. You were right. It was always for the guilty." She held his gaze. "Go inside, Elder Devon." He went inside. The others followed. The door closed. She did not touch it. She simply turned toward it. And it understood. The way the door of the den had always understood. The way everything in this territory responded to the authority that had been trying to surface in her for 17 years. 3 bolts. She heard them slide home. The crowd was silent. The beast made no sound. It stood at the edge of the den, and its silver eyes were steady and ancient, and entirely without drama. The expression of something that had waited a very long time for this particular accounting, and found it neither satisfying nor unsatisfying, but simply correct. The restoration of an order that certain men had spent a long time disrupting. They did not have to wait long. The sounds that came from inside were not sounds she would describe. They were not sounds anyone in that crowd would describe afterward, or not in detail, not to their children. They would say only that they heard them, and that they understood them. Why, and that they did not look away because witnessing was the only honest thing left to do. By the 3rd day, the sounds had stopped. On the morning of the 4th, what remained was left at the door. The pack moved quietly through its accounting in the days that followed. There were things to be undone, carefully, the way you undid a knot that had been pulled tight for a long time. Slowly, with attention, working each loop back to find the original order beneath the tightness. Council seats to be assessed, records to be examined, families to whom truths were owed. The Luna came to her on the 2nd day. She stood in Venetia's doorway, a real doorway now, a proper room, not the narrow, damp quarters of the lower household. And she was a woman stripped of ceremony, wearing something plain, her hair loose. She looked older without ceremony, more real. "I did not know about your parents," she said. Venetia looked at her. "I knew about the sacrifices," the Luna said. "I knew the den was used as Devon described it. I believed his description." She paused. "I should have asked more questions. I was told that asking questions undermined stability, and I believed that too." Her voice was even, but beneath it something was exhausted. "I was wrong about a great many things." "Yes," Venetia said. "I would like to do better," the Luna said, "if you will allow me the chance." Venetia considered her. A woman who had nodded at a council table and filed something difficult in the drawer marked necessary and had not asked enough questions. Also a woman standing in a doorway in plain clothes admitting it, which was not nothing. "We will see," Venetia said. The Luna nodded. She turned to go, then stopped. "He has been asking about you," she said quietly, "every hour, since they let him out of the cell." She paused. "He won't rest." Venetia said nothing, but after the Luna left, she sat for a long moment in the quiet of her room, and the silver in her hands moved softly in the low light, and she thought about a cloak left on a cold night. A jar of honey with no note. A warm loaf of bread held carefully in cloth by someone who had thought about how to do it properly. A man who had looked at her across fire-lit rooms with no cruelty in him at all, only the quiet, steady concern of someone who had decided she was worth being concerned about and had never once asked her to justify that decision. She stood. They had put him in one of the senior warriors' rooms, a room with a proper bed and a fire, which was more than he had received in the cell, and she understood this was someone's attempt at restitution, even if it was an insufficient one. The door was unlocked. She stood outside it for a moment with her hand not quite touching the wood, and she breathed, and the silver in her hands settled into something quieter, something that had nothing to do with power or authority or the ancient weight of what she carried. Just her. Just Venetia. Standing outside a door. She pushed it open. He was awake. Of course he was awake. She had been told he hadn't slept, and she could see it in him, in the bruising beneath his eyes and the particular quality of alertness that came from a body that had pushed past exhaustion into a kind of vigilance that ran on something beyond rest. He was sitting up in the bed with his back against the headboard and a bandage along his left forearm and a cut on his jaw in the late stages of healing. And when the door opened, he turned and saw her, and something in his face did what faces did when a long, sustained tension was suddenly, completely released. He exhaled. Just that. Just a breath let out, long, slow, the breath of someone who had been holding it for days and had finally been given permission to stop. "You're alive," he said. "I'm alive," she said. She came into the room. The fire was low but steady, throwing warm light across the stone floor, and she crossed it and sat on the edge of the bed because her legs were suddenly less certain than they had been all morning, all the days before. All the hours of standing before the pack and the council and the accumulated weight of 17 years finally arriving at their resolution. She sat, and he was close, and the fire moved between them, and she looked at him properly for the first time since the village square, since she had stood in chains and seen him kneeling bloodied in the dirt, and felt her heart break in a register entirely separate from the one that was already broken. "Your hands," he said quietly. She looked down. The silver was still there, softer now, not the bright, coursing lightning of the den's threshold, but something gentler, ambient, the way embers glowed after the fire had done its work. She turned her palms upward. He looked at them for a long moment. Then slowly, with the deliberate care of someone who had thought a great deal about how to do something and was finally doing it, he reached out and placed both of his hands beneath hers. Not holding, just beneath. Offering. The silver light moved toward his warmth. She watched it happen, the way it shifted direction like water finding a source, and the sensation of it moved up through her wrists and her arms and settled in her chest where it joined something that had been quiet and waiting for a very long time. "I'm sorry," he said. "I thought they were—" "I know," she said. "If I had known they would go to— Eric." His name in her mouth quieted him. "I know." He looked at her. The firelight moved across the cut on his jaw, the dark circles. The face of a man who had made a decision in a cell corridor with a stolen key and had paid for it without regret, and would pay for it again, she understood, without hesitation. "You came back for me," she said. Not a question, not an accusation. Just the fact of it, held up in the light between them so they could both look at it. "Of course I did," he said. The simplicity of it. No ceremony, no explanation, no architecture of justification. Of course I did. As though there had been no other option that he had seriously considered. She felt the tears arrive before she decided to let them. Not the grief tears of the cell, not the helpless tears of the village square. Something different. The tears that came when something you had protected yourself against believing for a very long time finally got through. When the careful distance you had maintained collapsed, and what was on the other side of it was not the disappointment you had braced for, but something warm and steady and real. She did not look away or cover her eyes or do any of the things she had always done with tears in front of other people. She let him see them. His thumb moved, a single slow pass across the back of her hand, careful, like everything he did, deliberate, like everything he did, and she felt it move through the silver light and through her skin and through the 17 years of carrying things alone, and something in the architecture of her chest rearranged itself around the fact of not being alone in this moment. "Your father," she said. "My father made his choices." His voice was even but not without weight. "I made mine." She looked at him. "You've been making yours for a long time," she said. He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression. Not the careful management of a man hiding what he felt, but the expression of someone letting something be seen that he had kept low and quiet for a long time, behind stolen keys and warm bread and jars of honey and all the small, deliberate languages of a man who had found the one acceptable way to say something he had not yet found permission to say directly. "So have you," he said. The fire moved. Somewhere outside, the settlement carried on its mourning, voices and movement and the ordinary rhythms of a world beginning to feel its way towards something new, something it didn't have a full shape for yet but was learning. The accountability and the grief and the slow, necessary work of a pack, finding out who it wanted to be now that the story it had been living inside had come apart. All of that was outside. In here there was firelight and a man who had never once looked at her with anything that had cruelty in it, and her hands in his hands with silver moving gently between them, and the particular silence of two people who had arrived by separate and difficult routes, at the same place at the same time. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He went still for a moment, that single beat of stillness, a man receiving something he had not let himself anticipate. And then she felt him exhale again, slow and complete, and his shoulders settled beneath her, and his head inclined the smallest degree toward hers. They sat. The fire burned low. The silver in her hands moved softly, warmly, with the patient luminescence of something that had been buried for 17 years and had finally, irrevocably, found its way to the surface. Outside, the wind moved through the settlement. Inside, there was only this, the quiet after everything, the warmth after the cold, the simplest and most radical thing in the world. Two people, choosing each other, not by fate, not by pack law, not by the careful mathematics of lineage and hierarchy and what was permitted, by choice, freely, finally.